right, we're going to keep on moving. And again, we want to remind those of you that are watching us via social media to participate in the conversation using the hashtag EndItNowNAD, EndItNowNAD. And if you want to use social media as well, please feel free. We're going to keep moving right along. And our next presenter is probably no stranger to those of you here in the audience and many of you watching us at home. David Sedlacek. David is a professor of family ministry and discipleship here at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary at Andrews University. He received his master's and doctorate in social work from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. He has worked in various settings, both public and private, as a clinician, a researcher, a teacher, a pastor, and administrator. He has worked extensively in the areas of addiction, abuse, relationships, marriage, and family. He is a certified family life educator and a licensed clinical social worker, and currently directs the MA in Youth and Young Adult Ministries program here at the seminary, together with his wife, Beverly. He has written a book entitled Cleansing the Sanctuary of the Heart, Tools for Emotional Healing, along with its accompanying workbook. Please help me welcome David Sedlacek.
Thank you for coming, even though I know you had to come. But thank you so much for being here. Spiritual abuse is something that is very, very important for us as pastors, as seminary students to address. And I'm going to build on the excellent content that Dr. Drum already gave us about spiritual abuse. So the National Domestic Violence Hotline gives us this information. Spiritual abuse can be hard to identify, but is no less difficult to endure than any other kind of abuse. It's much more subtle because it sounds so spiritual. And because we're Christians, we want to be spiritual, and spiritual abuse is intertwined with our spirituality so much that sometimes it's hard to sort out. And so we're going to try to do a job of sorting that out this afternoon. So I want to give you some definitions of spiritual abuse to begin with. So sometimes spiritual abuse, by the way, is also called religious abuse. So it can be used either way, but spiritual abuse, intended or unintended, occurs when a person in a position of power uses that power to manipulate or control the thoughts or actions of those under their leadership. Now, there's some things in this definition that I really want to point out. One is that it's either intended or unintended. And I would venture to say that many people who are spiritual abusers don't know that that's what they're doing. They're operating within their cultural context, which sometimes is abusive, simply in terms of their culture. Sometimes they simply are sincerely not knowing, they're thinking they're following the Bible, but they're not understanding that what they're doing is abusive. That's one reason why it's important to have this seminar, because knowledge, as Renee said, is so important. We want to give you knowledge to help you identify whether it's in you or whether it's in someone who's in your sphere of influence, that what they're doing is abusive. And let me ask you this. If you observe someone else being spiritually abusive, do you have a responsibility to say something about it? Absolutely we do. Not to condemn them, not to judge them, but to inform them, to educate them. Look, we can kindly point out to people, look, what you're doing is abusive, and strongly say it's not okay. Strongly say it's not okay. So it can be intended or unintended, but people in positions of authority, spiritual authority, can be spiritual abusers, and we're going to identify who they are in a little bit. Another aspect of that definition is this. It is often done by creating a toxic culture within the church or group by shaming or controlling members using the power of your position and neutralizing or eliminating dissent. Okay? In other words, people who tend to be spiritual abusers are people who kind of think they're right. Okay? And if I'm right, that makes you what? Makes you wrong. And so I'm going to use my position to convince you that I'm right about whatever it is that I believe. So I can shame you, or I can control you. And sometimes shaming can be rather subtle. For example, it can be, well, you didn't do what I thought you should be doing, and so, you should know better because you're a Christian and you're someone who perhaps is another leader, and so because you're not doing what I'm not thinking you should do, then you're less than. You're a poor Christian, and so I'm going to have a happy Sabbath while you're thinking about what I just shamed you into doing. That's an example of using shame to control someone who's not doing what you think they should be doing. So let's look at potential perpetrators. Officials at all levels of leadership, can they be spiritually abusers? Okay? Now, when I'm saying all levels of leadership, I mean all levels, not just pastors, but conference officials and so forth. Can they be spiritually abusers too, or even general conference officials? Are they immune just because they're in a certain position of responsibility in the church? No, they're not. They're not. In fact, we have support for people who are in relationship with them. And so be aware that any position of leadership, they can be spiritual abusers. Can pastors be spiritual abusers? Elders, deacons, deaconesses, Sabbath school teachers, okay? Church members who see it as their duty to make sure that everyone lives up to the standards of the church. Have you ever had anyone in your church kind of like that? Sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so, it's their job to make sure the church is pure and that everyone's living up to the standards of the church. And they, of course, deal with you if you're not doing what they think you should be doing. That's spiritually abusive. And we need to be able to label it as such. Okay? How about parents or other caregivers? Sabbath school teachers. Anyone in that position. Because let me ask you this. Parents, who do they represent in the lives of their children? They represent God, don't they? You're the first representative of God in the lives of the children who God has blessed you with. And how you exercise your position as parents is going to give your children a particular view of God. God is demeaning, or God is abusive. God can't be trusted. All of those things are messages that we send to our children as parents. And it's important that we understand that we stand in God's place and give an idea of who God is. So let's take a look at the profile of perpetrators, the emotional profile. First of all, many of them are personally insecure. And so what they're trying to do is compensate for their insecurity by being authoritative and controlling of others. So understand that when you're dealing with spiritual abusers, you're dealing with someone who probably has a lot of fear, a tendency toward perfectionism, okay? They think they have to be perfect and do it all right, who are performance-oriented. In other words, they try to perform in order to earn God's love, to earn other people's approval, okay? They have a need for power and control, a need to look good or competent in the eyes of others, okay? Now, pastors, those of you who are pastors here, how many of you, when you've preached a great sermon and you go out to shake hands or have people shake your hand, you want to hear, oh, you did a great sermon, Pastor, okay? That need for affirmation is something that we need to be careful of, because what it's saying is that we're getting our sense of self from someone else. And so if someone says you gave a rotten sermon, What would you do with that? No, you might believe that more than you'd believe the affirmations, So again, this dynamic is really, really important for us to understand. So a life dominated by fear, theology of fear, rather than God loves me unconditionally. I don't have to perform for God because I know I'm loved. That question of our lovability has not been settled in a lot of us. So it's really important. So the vulnerable children. Children who have parents who control their every thought and action, have not been taught to think for themselves, but who parrot their parents' words, thoughts, and actions, who have been raised with an unhealthy fear of an angry, vindictive, or arbitrary God, children who have received confusing messages about God through conflicting words and actions from their parents or church leaders. These are the characteristics of vulnerable children. Now, psychospiritual abuse, religiously based psychological abuse of children can involve using teachings to subjugate children through fear or indoctrinating the child in the beliefs of their particular religion while suppressing other perspectives. It has to be this way. Psychologist Jill Mighton describes this as crushing the child's chance to form a personal morality and belief system. How many of young people, even at college age, when they're outside of their parents' control, leave the belief system of their parents because it's been so repressive, so rigid? This is a form of psychospiritual abuse. And so it makes these children utterly reliant and dependent on their religion. They don't have a way of thinking for themselves. Let's take a look at what Ellen White has to say about this, okay? The education of children at home or at school should not be like the training of dumb animals. For children have an intelligent will which should be directed to control all their powers. What should control their powers? They should be taught to choose their own will, right? A child may be so trained as to have, like the beast, no will of his own. Even his individuality may be merged in the one who superintends his training. His will, to all intents and purposes, is subject to the will of the teacher. Do you see we're setting our kids up for abuse if that's the way we train them? Children who are thus educated will ever be delinquent in moral energy and individual responsibility. They have not been taught to move from reason and principle. So let's take a look at vulnerable adults now, vulnerable to spiritual abuse. Adults who've never fully differentiated from their parents. In other words, their parents have never cut the apron strings. They still want them to stay attached to them. And so these kids don't have a mind of their own. Okay? These adults don't. And so 1 Corinthians 13:11, they've never put away the things of a child, even though they're adults. They don't have a solid sense of themselves, but are overly dependent on the thoughts and approval of others. They too live by fear and shame. They've not experienced the love of God for themselves. They've not been able to embrace it for themselves. They have difficulty trusting enough. They don't trust anyone. Or the other extreme, they trust too much. They don't have the ability to set healthy boundaries and to say no because they've been spiritually, emotionally abused. Other examples, slave masters misused the scripture, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling as to Christ. And they thus misrepresented God. Okay? Abusive husbands use wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, to control their spouses. Cult leaders such as David Koresh manipulated his followers to the point of death, convincing them that they're following God. Okay? Now, I want to tell you about a couple of research studies that I was principal investigator of related to spiritual abuse. We did a study of Oakwood University students while I was a professor there, and since I moved here, we did a study of Andrews and Southern students. okay, between 2009 and 2012. So the following are the results of frequency of spiritual abuse reported by students. 27.5% of males reported spiritual abuse, and 28.5% of females reported spiritual abuse. So this is over a quarter, okay? Now, here's what we asked them. Okay? The Bible or other religious writings were used to make me conform, yes or no? Okay? When you've been hurt, has religion been used to discount your reality? For example, you're just not being submissive enough, or you just need to pray more or believe more. Okay? Or, as a child, were you shamed or condemned when you asked questions of your parents or spiritual leaders related to spiritual beliefs? Or, the fourth question, have your spiritual leaders ever told you that they are the only ones that can correctly interpret spiritual writings? And number 5, my family would behave one way at church, synagogue, or temple, and then behave differently at home. Now, these 5 questions had an alpha of 0.90, which meant they hung together very well as a scale. Okay? These were the questions that we asked. So again, over a quarter of the respondents answered yes. Now, spiritual abuse and intersectionality. In other words, is spiritual abuse also connected to other types of abuse? Okay? So our study, as well as the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, showed that one type of abuse usually is also connected to another type of abuse. Okay? In other words, when you have one, you're likely to have another. So our research showed mild to moderate correlations between spiritual abuse and physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Spiritual abuse was also correlated with the following dependent variables. And again, we were studying college students, okay? So challenges in the area of spiritual life, troubled relationships, self-indulgence, like eating more, being addicted to something, addictions, emotional volatility. In other words, I get angry, or depressed or anxious real easily, or decreased academic performance. Okay, so spiritual abuse had correlations with each of these other kinds of things that happened. In other words, it diminishes our capacity to perform well in all of these areas as students. Okay? Other areas of intersectionality. When a pastor sexually abuses a child or a woman in the congregation, not only is there sexual abuse, but there's also spiritual abuse. Do you see that? Because of the pastor's position, when he's performing some kind of sexual abuse, he's also giving that person an inappropriate view of what a spiritual leader or God is like. Okay? Or when a child is physically abused by a parent who represents God, the child's capacity to trust God is diminished. Do you see that? Okay? Or when non-Christians experience Christians as unloving, judgmental, rejecting, or better than, they're being spiritually abused. Do you get that? Do you agree with me that those are types of spiritual abuse, and that how we conduct ourselves as Christians is giving the non-Christian world a picture of God that we may not want to give them? Is there any wonder sometimes, even in our evangelistic events, it's like, oh, I'm not sure I want to go to these people because my experience of them is not one of being loving, reflecting the character of God, being kind, courteous, friendly, but, we have the truth. You don't have the truth. Therefore, we're here and you are less than. Okay? We always need to give a different message than that. We need to be aware of the message that we're giving about God, because it's driving people away from God, which I believe is a form of spiritual abuse. So, signs of spiritual abuse between intimate partners include the following. When an abusive partner ridicules, insults the other person's religious or spiritual beliefs. Okay? So perhaps when you are in an equally yoked marriage, okay, if your spiritual beliefs, even if the other person might be a Christian or might be an Adventist, if they're putting you down, oh, you think because you're a vegan, you're better than me. Okay, that kind of language. So if you ridicule or insult your partner's spiritual beliefs, that's a form of spiritual abuse. Or prevents the other partner from practicing their religious or spiritual beliefs. You can't go to church this Sabbath, or Sunday if they happen to be a Sunday keeper. You're controlling them because of what you think is true. Okay, so preventing them from freely exercising their religion or spiritual beliefs. Or using their partner's religious or spiritual beliefs to manipulate or shame them. Oh, you're not a very good Christian. Look at you. You just got upset with me, because I did something stupid. But I'm shaming you because you're getting upset with me. Or forcing the children to be raised in a faith other than that the other partner has not agreed to. In other words, you're courting and you're dating, and you're all in love, and so you make this agreement. Oh, we'll raise the kids, Adventist or Christian or whatever. But after the marriage is done, you change your tune. Okay, that's a form of spiritual abuse. Okay, preventing the children from being raised in a way that you have mutually agreed to. Okay, or using religious texts or beliefs to minimize or rationalize abusive behaviors such as physical, financial, emotional, or sexual abuse or marital rape, as we saw, from Dr. Drum's excellent presentation. So those are signs of spiritual abuse between intimate partners. So in addition to whatever other spiritual or intimate partner violence that has occurred, victims experience additional spiritual abuse when it is not safe for them to speak to church leadership due to patriarchal norms. Okay? Now, Renee gave us examples of someone who was sexually abused speaking to their pastor and being discounted, right? That kind of thing. So the question is, if you're a member of a church, do you feel that as a member you have a right to go to someone in a position of church leadership and express, whatever your needs are or your challenges are, or is that something that's okay for you to do? Or has an environment been created where you're intimidated from doing that? That's a form of spiritual abuse. Okay? Or the victim's experience is discounted when they share it by statements such as, he's not that kind of person, or I could never imagine him doing such a thing. He's such a nice man or woman. Okay? Because, again, by the way, how many men are abused? Do you know? How many men are victims of violence in families? What percentage would you guess?
20.
More.
35.
Closer to 40. About 40% are also victims, okay? So we need to understand that, okay? Or a victim is marginalized. In other words, you do a report, on your husband, and you bring it before the church, and what happens to you? You're the one that gets removed from office because you lied on him, right? So you get removed from office. So you get disfellowshipped even because you're lying on this fine man, okay? So you're again being re-victimized, not just by your spouse, but you're being re-victimized again by the church, by the way you're treated in the church. Oops, what did I just do? Okay, so here's some more inspired thoughts. In matters of conscience, the soul must be left untrammeled. No one is to control another's mind, to judge for another, or to prescribe his duty. God gives to every soul freedom to think and to follow his own convictions. Every one of us shall give account of himself to God. No one has the right to merge his own individuality in that of another. In all matters where principle is involved, let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. In God's kingdom there is no lordly oppression, no compulsion of manner. The angels of heaven do not come to earth to rule, to exact homage, but as messengers of mercy, to cooperate with men in uplifting humanity. Any man, be he layman or minister, who seeks to compel or control the reason of another, becomes an agent of Satan to do his work. And in the sight of the heavenly universe, he bears the mark of Cain. Okay? So in summary, spiritual abuse can be subtly but powerfully used in one of the most harmful forms of abuse because it impacts many other areas of life. It's been found to be correlated with negative outcomes in several areas of students' life. It is found largely in religious conservative communities that have a high value on being right or having the truth, and it can have lasting effects on a person's ability to have a trusting, intimate relationship with God and with other human beings. Thank you for being so attentive and listening. My name is David Sedlacek, and I've been a victim of spiritual abuse and domestic violence.